Hey guys, for these bird studies I'm using Canson Watercolor XL. It's 140-pound cold pressed paper sold at Hobby Lobby, Michael's. It's on sale all the time. I don't really recommend it for doing just watercolor, but it works pretty good for watercolor pencils, felt pens. I'm using it for that for different projects. Again, it's a cellulose paper. It's not the best for watercolor, but like I said, it's really doing pretty good with these watercolor pencils. Got a mixture of watercolor pencils. These is Generals. Got an Artist Loft, which is Michael's brand. Got a Derwent. And I didn't think I had some Crayola ones in here too. I've drawn my light sketch. I wanted to show you some tips and tricks on using watercolor pencils. One thing I've learned about watercolor pencils, it's best to do lightly, kind of build up layers, light to dark. The areas where you don't want a lot of pigment, you just barely put any pigment down from the pencil. Areas where you want dark pigment, you lay in heavier layers of pigment from the pencils. It's kind of a cross between painting with watercolors and drawing. So it's kind of a fun way to do things. Okay, so the sketch is done with the watercolor pencils. Now this is where the fun begins. I find that if I use a brush that doesn't hold very much water, which is usually my, I can't remember what you call these things now. Liner brush, I think it is, yeah. So what I do is I dip it in water, but then I wipe off any excess water. I like to start with my dark colors first. The less water you use, the better, I find. Doesn't take much to get the pigment loosened up and flowing in there. you get too much water on your brush, you just create a big puddle of water, and then the pigments it turns into a wet and wet. And the pigments are a mess all over your drawing, your paper. So I always just like to hit the dark spots first, because that way later when you go back in and do the light stuff, the darks don't tend to bleed into the light areas as much. Almost getting too much water there on it. Just dab off your brush a little bit. And you can move the pigment around too with the brush to create kind of different shapes. Then I'll start hitting the lighter colors. So that's basically what you're doing, is working light to dark colors to light, wetting them with a little bit of water, not to spread too much pigment around. So I'm going to put this back in time lapse or hyperlapse. Okay, I like to use a micron pen to go back in and put the eye details in. Now that that's all sets up and dries, then I'm going to go in and do my background. I'm going to do that with regular old transparent watercolors. Okay, like I said, I'm using plain old transparent watercolor here to do the background. If you touch the wet brush to the watercolor pencil, you can get some bleeding out of it, so you got to be careful not to Right there, you see where I touched the edge of that feather and it starts to bleed out. Even after it's dried, you'll get a little bit of bleeding. That kind of softens the edges. The looks of that red right in there, I don't think I hit that red beak earlier. I didn't. And I'm getting some bleeding there. I should have waited. I should have done that before I did the background. Oh well. I'll let that set up a little bit before I work around that area some more. Let's drop some green in here and see what happens. This cheap paper, you get too much water and it puddles really bad. That's why I found I liked doing it better for felt pens and these watercolor pencils, because you don't use a whole lot of water. But with watercolor paint, wet and wet, you want to use quite a bit of water for those neat effects. I'm getting some bleed there where I touched that black. It starts to bleed out a little bit. Like I said, that's okay. That gives it some neat textures and softens edges. Try to cover up some of that blue right there that bled out. Bleeding out right there too a little bit. One thing that's fun to do is to move it around so that the really wet paint can move around and create special neat effects. See how that paint's not going into that dry spot there? That's with watercolor. The paint will only go where the wetness of the paper is. A lot of water on there and a lot of paint on there, so I'm going to have to let that set up, let it dry. So that's working with watercolor pencils.